Hello and welcome to this tutorial on Unity Introduction and the Terrain tool in Unity. My name is Chauncey Friend and I work in the Indiana University UITS Advanced Visualization Lab. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on kind of Unity in the perspective of its development use for virtual reality and augmented reality. So the first thing you need to do is install Unity. So I'm going to go to unity3d.com. And on this website, there's a variety of interesting things available here, but specifically for you if you're interested in learning about Unity, I'm assuming that's why you're here for this tutorial. There is a Learn button on the Unity page, and they have like tons of tutorials that they've made. There's literally not enough time in most people's lifetimes to go through a lot of these tutorials, because some of them are like long webinars and things, but the key is to focus on the specific things that you want to learn. And I believe on this page, just to kind of make something aware to you, if you go to training or tutorials, and then you scroll down, they do have everything by topic here. So if you're here to learn about VR and AR, that's going to be under the XR tab. If you're just here to learn about like Unity physics or Unity for artists, it's all there. And this tutorial is an overview introduction, and generally what I show my students and collaborators and researchers that I work with here at IU. So to install Unity, going back to what we need to do, you got to press Get Started at the top right here. They have a pricing plan here. Don't be too intimidated. You can run the personal edition, and it has everything in it that the other two would have, except for just like, I think like the splash screen can be a little different and all this, but you don't have to pay for Unity necessarily until you are building commercial products, and the personal edition is good to go for most projects. So I'm going to scroll to the bottom of this page actually, and I'm looking for this button here that says older versions of Unity, and click that. If you wanted to get back to this page directly and not click through, just Google search for Unity Archive, and that's what you're going to get here. So you can see they keep on file all the different types of Unity that go all the way back to Unity 3 that you can download. That goes back to 2011, I think. Yeah, 2011. So I'm just going to use the latest here, and what you really want is the Unity installer. So if you're on Mac or PC, the Unity installer here. And what that does is just generate a quick little installer file that will actually download all of the components you need as it installs. So I'll go ahead and run that. Obviously you'll need admin access to be able to do this on the system that you're going to install it on. And as you can see here, I'm using 2018.3.6 F1. You should make a note of this if you're taking notes with your project or your research, because you don't really want to change versions once you start building a project unless you absolutely need to. So next, and then the other thing is make sure your collaborators are using the same version if you're all working on the same project. Okay, so this is kind of where I wanted you specifically to see what I'm thinking of. So if you're working with AR for tablets, you probably need the Android build support and the iOS build support. However, if you're on a Windows device, you probably don't even want to install the iOS build support, because you can't compile from a Windows device to like an iPad or an iPhone, so you can kind of ignore that. If you're doing like VR stuff that is on Google Daydream, you're going to need Android build support. If you're working with the Microsoft HoloLens, you're going to need uwpbuildsupport.net and Windows build support IL2 CPP, and I always check this one as well just in case. Vuforia augmented reality support, you're going to need that if you use the Vuforia plugin, so you want to check that. The Vuforia plugin can be used on Apple devices or Android devices or the HoloLens, and there's a few other devices that are not as common, but yeah. And then if you're building for VR for the web, there is some experimental capabilities with WebGL to do this, but VR on the web doesn't really work from Unity yet. But if you're compiling to put 3D content or 2D content from Unity onto the web, you'll want WebGL. And then that's pretty much what I install typically as a VR AR developer in the AVL. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next, and the next thing you want to pay attention to is you're eventually probably going to have, depending on how much work you use with Unity, how much like projects you do with Unity, you're probably going to have different copies of Unity around. Yes, I'm going to browse and specifically put it in its own new folder. So I'm going to go into the program files folder. If you're on Mac, this would be in your apps folder, and you want to make a new folder that's the version that you're using. So I'll just name it Unity 2018.3.6 F1. That'll help me stay organized, because as you can see here, I have way too many copies of Unity installed on my computer. That's just because I support many different projects and researchers that use Unity. But for you, it's just a good idea to have this labeled, so that when you the reason I tell you all this is because if you install Unity, like it's saying, like if you already have Unity in your system and you install a new version, it might overwrite your old version. So it's best to just separate them all out manually into folders. They have a thing called Unity Hub, which I'm not covering in this tutorial. That'll help you just run Unity Hubs and select which version you want to run from there. But again, you have to make sure your directories are organized on where it is. Okay, hit next, and then it will download. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward this video until after it's all downloaded and installed. Okay, so it's finished installed. One of the things I didn't mention was if you don't already have Visual Studio on your computer, the Unity installer will likely install Visual Studio, and you'll have to accept a separate license agreement that's during the installation. But it's pretty self-explanatory. You just hit accept and move forward. I already have Visual Studio, so it didn't prompt me. All right, let's move on. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that copy of Unity I just installed. I'm going to dig for it just because I have so many copies of Unity on my computer here. So one moment. Okay, so opening Unity first, you'll be prompted with basically a splash screen, and then it's going to let you log in. You won't see projects like I have here. These are all previous projects that I've worked on. It'll probably just be empty here for you if it's the first time you've ran it. And it might want you to sign in. So I'm going to sign out of mine and sign in. It is a good idea to have a Unity ID, and to sign in, you can sign in with your Google account or your Facebook account. If you're an IU person, you have a G Suite account, which is a Gmail address using your IU username. So you can actually sign in with Google like that. Let me see if that works here for you. So I'm going to do cfriend@IU. That's my email address. And then it should direct me to CAS. Yep, right away. And you just log in like normal with Duo. All right. So linking your Google account. I already have a Unity ID with this email address, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel and then log in with that Unity ID, my regular Unity ID that I created. I created this a while ago before they had the Google sign in, but you can follow through with what they have for you and sign in. Now this sign in is just associated with assets mostly, and then like if you wanted to buy assets later, you could re-find them again. So that's why it's important. We're going to create a new project, so find this button that says new and click that, and choose where you want to have your project be. I'm going to have mine in the downloads folder, and 3D for the template. You don't need to add any asset packages. If you do click this, it's just going to look for any of them that you have around, and you may have none. And then I'm just going to put this as Unity Introduction and Terrain. Actually, I do want to put it in a specific spot, so I have a VR Tutorials folder. I'm going to put it in. There we go. There. Okay. And then make sure Enable Unity Analytics is off. You won't need this probably for most of the projects that you do. Most of this is like online services and analytics that go with products. And if you're doing research stuff, most of the time you are not going to be using this. Create project. What it's actually going to do now in the background is generate a folder structure and open Unity, of course, accessing that folder structure. So I want to highlight the folder structure real quick. I know this isn't too exciting yet, but this is important for you to know. Sorry, I'm digging for my folder. There we go. So I just created this Unity Introduction. I'll make it bigger for you. Unity Introduction Terrain. If you go inside of it, you're going to see assets, library, logs, packages, project settings, temp. Now, if you ever see a project structure like this, like on GitHub or something like that, this is a kind of the red flag, or not red flag, but this is sort of this assets folder. If you see that, most likely it's a Unity project. If you happen to see this structure. So if someone were to work with me and send me, let's say, their project, oftentimes what they, if they're new to Unity, they'll send me their scene, which it'll look like this, like sample scene.unity or whatever it is. And that actually doesn't help me at all, because you actually need all of the folders to send. So if you were to send your project to somebody, you would want to make sure Unity's closed and not accessing the folder, and you want to right click and send to a compressed folder. If you're on a Mac, you can also zip things up like this, compress them, and then it becomes one object that you can upload on Box or some other file sharing service, and actually share them the link and download and unzip the project. If someone were to share with you a Unity project and you wanted to access it in Unity, you want to make sure you're using the right version of Unity, like I said. So we're 2018.3.6. The way I can see that is you open up, after you unzip it, you open up the project folder, go into project settings. There should be a text document here that just says project version, and the only thing it should say on the inside is what version this project was last saved in. Okay, so that way you can take this, go right to that Unity archive website that we got the install from, and go ahead and install the correct version. And that way you're not sort of screwing up the project's code, because different versions can have problems with code if you switch versions. All right. And also, like, there's assets or things in Unity that can get kind of screwed up and have collisions, and you'll see errors that are sort of unknown and mysterious, which you don't want to have. All right, let me talk about the interface a little bit. So I'm going to, up here at the top, there's a little drop-down box that lets you change the layout. I'm going to switch it to default. That's what you're generally going to see when you're looking at Unity. The first thing to note is this is really simple down here at the bottom or under the project tab. By the way, everything in Unity is basically just sort of a floating tab that you can dock into the interface, so you can move these around if you need to. That's pretty typical in creative software suites. Now, inside of the project tab, you're going to see that assets folder. Remember I mentioned that a little bit ago? And then inside there we have a scenes folder, and there's a packages folder in there for some reason. I don't know why that's in there. I think I turned analytics off, but for some reason it brought that in. Not sure. I don't need analytics, but I'll just leave it there. And this is just what you're seeing out in your Finder or Windows Explorer window. So if I go into Assets, there's scenes there, same thing. So if we create folders out here, say if I make a folder called Models, maybe I'll make a folder here called Scripts, or maybe you just want to type a README document. So you just say create new text file, say README. That way, when you share your project with other people, they would have to go in here and you can actually, read some instructions on your project to help them out. So if I go back into Unity, all those should populate in. So yeah, there's the models folder, scenes, there's my README file, and it's empty, but it would show up here if it had anything in it. And that's the way to think about this, is just essentially a folder or a file and asset explorer down here. Okay, and in the center of the screen is the 3D scene, and there's actually a few tabs here. So there's the scene tab right here, there's the game tab right next to it, okay? And then there's the one called Asset Store right next to that. So when I had you log in, you'll see your username here in the top right, okay? So you can see once you get here into the Asset Store, this is just a web page that is, you can see your orders, your list, your profile, and all that stuff. By the way, the Unity Asset Store is just, like I said, a website, so you can get to it just from a regular web browser, just Unity Asset Store, and sort of look around here on the web. interface instead of inside of the Unity web interface. So yeah, we don't need that right quite yet, but from here you're going to be able to download different assets. You could buy assets, different effects, things you might want to put in your project. I've used it quite a bit in my projects actually. There's a lot of good, talented artists out there and programmers building neat stuff that's somewhat free or for a low price. So in the scene view, this is where you're going to be working primarily if you're working on a 3D project. You have a bunch of buttons up in the top left. If you press this hand, you have the ability to pan around the space. If you press the tool next to it, you have essentially just a selection tool. Okay. Rotate is the next one. So like if you have something selected, like I selected this directional light, which you can read right here. Now we can rotate that. Okay, and it changes because that's a light. That's actually changing the time of day in the scene. And then right next to that is a scale tool. So scaling the directional light doesn't make any sense because it's just a light source. So I'm going to hit Game Object, 3D Object, Sphere. Now we have a sphere. And again, by clicking on the scale object, you have the ability with these handles to shape it, scale it. Okay. And then you can hit undo or hit Control Z. Right next to that is the rectangle tool, which we're not going to use right now. That's for 2D, and then move and rotate. So move and rotate is actually a pretty interesting tool. So it allows you to move your object and rotate it all in one tool. Okay. So if you're familiar with like Maya or 3D programs like Maya, there is a set of hotkeys that work in Unity that are the same. So if I was to select this sphere and want to scale it, I can just press R on the keyboard. And right next to R to the left of it is E, that's rotate, which I know doesn't make sense because it's R for scale and E for rotate. And then W is move. And those three you're going to bounce between a lot. So I highly recommend getting used to these hotkeys, W, E, and R. And the next thing you're going to do a lot when you're working in Unity is tumbling the screen or rotating the screen so you can actually see what's going on. So if you're on a Mac, I think it's Command or Option. You hold that button down. If you're on a PC, it's Alt, and you'll see your cursor change into an eyeball. And as you click and drag your left mouse button. By the way, you want to have a 3-button mouse when you're doing this stuff. You can see you're tumbling around and seeing things from different perspectives, and you're going to use this a lot to try to line things up. And I actually, while I'm doing this, sometimes will use the middle mouse button. If you have a wheel, you can zoom in and out, right? And then if you have a middle mouse button that's a wheel that you can press down, it actually turns into the hand so you can pan, right? And then I think that's it. Just those two. Yeah, and I switch a lot between zooming, rotating, panning, just like you're seeing here. And you can see you can really examine the world. And something that I always forget to tell people, but I'm just remembering it now, is you can actually drive around the virtual world. So let's see if I can remember how to do this. Yeah, so you use the arrow keys on your keyboard. Not WASD, but the arrow keys. And you can sort of just drive around the virtual world. Zooming and strafing pretty much. Okay. So that's a good way to sort of manipulate the objects in the world and change your view in the world, in the scene view. Next, I want you to be aware of this hierarchy on the left side. So this is everything that's in our scene. So by default, we're in the sample scene, which you can read at the top here, sample scene.unity. And you have a sphere, a directional light, and a main camera. Okay, and essentially you could put anything in here, and it's all just going to be in this list. And this is a kind of an inventory of what you have. You can also make certain objects children of objects. So like for instance, this main camera, you can see it's got a preview when I click on it of the sphere. If I move this around, we're going to see in the preview window the sphere getting closer and further away. Okay, but let's say if I take this sphere here in the hierarchy and make it a child of the camera just by dragging it on top of it, it indented it right there, and it's right below main camera. So that they're actually together now, and the main camera is a parent. And anything you do to the parent, it will it will translate into the the child. So if I move, you can see here it's rotating, and in the screen it's staying right in front of the camera, and the only thing that's changing is the lighting on the surface of the sphere. Now, if you select just the sphere by itself, you can move it as a child of the main camera. And then now it's closer, but you got to make sure to click on it explicitly to be able to manipulate it. Because if you click on main camera, it's just going to move everything that's in that group. Okay, so next I'd like to talk a little bit more about the right side of the screen here that's been changing as I click things. That's called the inspector. Now, the way I like to describe the inspector is it's just a list or an inventory like the hierarchy is, instead of game objects, but it's a list of scripts. Okay, so if I go to game object, create empty, it's going to create this empty little object that you can see right here in space. You press F, it'll center it up on your screen, and it just has, you know, a location sitting here. If I hit W, zoom into it, there's actually nothing there. It's just a thing in space. It's a point in space that's empty that we can use. And if you look in the right, while I have game object selected in the inspector, it's just called game object. I can turn it on and off right here just by checking this box on and off. That's setting it active or setting it active false. Okay, and then it has one script associated with it. If you click on it, it kind of twirls closed there to kind of get out of your way. But the transform. So the transform contains its position, rotation, and scale, and that's pretty typical. So remember when we were pressing W, E, and R? So if I press E to do rotation and change it, oh, I'm moving it by clicking on the green line on the Y axis and rotating it. If I click the red axis, it moves that, which is the X axis. And then I would imagine, yep, the other one is the other one, so Z. And then scale, we could press R for scale. Oops. Let me click game object, and then I'll click R for scale. If I scale by one axis, you can see it just does the Z axis. And if I scale by the center, it scales it uniformly on all axes. Okay. And then if you get this all screwed up and you're like, oh shoot, I just need to reset this, you can right click on transform and say reset. And it'll basically put it in the dead center of your virtual world, the origin point, and set these back to 1 for scale and 0 for rotation. Okay, so the reason I mention all that in the inspector and the transform is you're going to work with that a lot in Unity and in 3D space, but adding components is basically adding scripts. So let's say we wanted to make this point in space a light source. So I can type in the word light, and then now it's a light. So it added the light script. If I twirl it closed, you can see it. Simple. Transform light. If I twirl open light, we can see all the public options. When I say public options, these are actually part of the script that are public that we can actually access and change through this nice little menu here. So the range of the light source, actually if you select the text here, this is a hidden little feature you can drag left and right. It's kind of neat. You could type in a value, of course. So if I set back to 10, press enter. Color, the same thing. You can click on the panel here and it brings up a nice little color picker for you to use. These drop down boxes are nice, and yeah, so it's a light source and it happens to be at this location, rotation, and scale. And let's see, what else can we do? Let's make it a camera as well. So camera. So there's the camera script. So now it's 3 scripts on the object, but it's a camera that emits light. So that's interesting. And we haven't written any code in it. We have this nice little camera that emits light. And I'm going to go ahead and delete our, I'm going to take the sphere out of that main camera. And I'm going to delete the old main camera that we had. And I'm going to change the name of this one. And I'll just say light camera. Right? Not sure why you would do this, but what's neat is if I move this close to the sphere here, we should be able to see the lighting changing on the sphere, but let me make it dark. So I'm going to click on our light source here, and I want to rotate it until it's somewhat like maybe nighttime. Yep, and then if we hit W and move this around, in the scene view at least, we can see the lighting change. The preview window, it looks like it's always going to be about the same, depending on how it sees it. You can see it is emitting light on the sphere itself. Pretty cool, huh? Now, I'm going to talk to you guys next about the asset store. One of the things we need from the asset store right away is a thing called standard assets. So click on the asset store tab at the top here and literally just search for standard assets. This is made by Unity technology, so Unity themselves publish this out to their asset store. It's just a bunch of assets that we won't use all of them, but it has a lot of things done for us already. So you're going to hit download and then import. It's a free asset, so you don't have to pay for it, even though it says right here you purchased it. I didn't purchase it, I just downloaded it. Okay, so when it unpackages it, you basically get this huge list of assets that are going to come into your project. So you can twirl these closed, like, and see that the entire standard assets library that you're bringing in is made up of only 2 folders. So that's kind of neat to take notice of. It's all basically simplified, and it's going to add these 2 folders to your project here, like I added models, scenes, and scripts. So I'll hit import, and it's just going to bring everything in, and we should see those 2 folders. Okay, so it brought standard assets in. We have now a couple new folders here, sample scenes and standard assets itself. We'll use those here in a moment. I'm going to change my light source back so that it's daytime again so we can see everything. And the next thing I want to do is show you the terrain tool. So we'll get back to standard assets here in a moment with our terrain, but Unity has this ability to create virtual worlds. Now, if you're building virtual reality and you want to have an environment that you can kind of walk around in that's somewhat nature-like, there are many ways to do this, and probably the easiest way to get doing this is to use Unity's terrain engine. So you go to Game Object, 3D Object, Terrain, okay, and it generates this giant plane, but this isn't necessarily a plane, right? So like if you go to Game Object, 3D Object, Plane, it makes a plane, and that's all it is. The way you can tell is it's smaller one, but a plane, since I have it selected, it'll just have these simple things like a collider, mesh renderer. There's no script here that makes it a piece of terrain. So if I click on the terrain object, it actually says specifically that it's a terrain object and it has a terrain collider on it. So it behaves much differently than a plane. I've seen students put a plane in and say, hey, this doesn't work. I don't understand what's happening. And it's just because they maybe misunderstood what they were looking at here in the tutorial. So with this, I'm going to click on the terrain and then press the F key on the keyboard. That's focus. And it sort of takes me to it. And now I'm looking straight at it. And the first thing you want to set with terrain is how big it is. So if you click the gear icon while clicking on terrain in the inspector, what we're looking at here is just the settings for terrain. So if you twirl that open, that's that gear on the right, terrain settings. There's a whole bunch of settings that are optional to change with terrain. And the one I want to make mention of that you should set right away is the terrain width and the terrain length and the terrain height. So I'm not actually going to change any of these. If you hover your mouse over them, specifically it'll tell you what's there. I'm not going to change anything, but just know that everything's in meters. So that is 500 meters by 500 meters. Every one of these squares you're seeing here is a meter by a meter. Okay, so in real world coordinates, which in a virtual reality or augmented reality system, you're using generally real world coordinates, you're matching sort of human scale. So a human is going to be quite small to put on this environment. In fact, we can kind of see generally what that's going to look like to visualize a human. So down in your assets, search for FPS. So just all caps, or actually I don't think it has to be all caps, FPS. Yeah, there you go. And you're going to find this little blue cube that says FPS control ... If you select that, it's actually called the FPS controller. You can see that down at the bottom right, there's a little slider to make your icons bigger or smaller. So FPS controller, that's what we're looking for. That's a prefab, which I'll talk about prefabs later. That's a prefabricated object in Unity that's all configured for walking around as like a human scale object that came in with standard assets. Okay, so that's where that came from. I'll drag that into the scene here. And one of the things, if you press F, you'll realize it's actually below the ground. So it's sticking out below the ground. So if we hit play, which, hold on a second, I'm going to actually get rid of this light emitting camera, because as you might have noticed when you brought the FPS controller in, it's got a camera on it, and we're going to use that camera. So let me get rid of my light camera that I was showing you earlier. Don't need that. I just clicked on it and hit delete on the keyboard. If I hit play here, we're going to fall through the ground and just keep falling forever. Oh, actually, Unity must have corrected something and put me actually on the terrain. In the past versions of Unity, you actually would have fallen. So if I put this below the ground, you'll just fall. And this is what that might look like if you encounter this. It's like, what's happening? There's nothing. Or I can't tell if I'm falling or not. And yes, you're falling. The way you can actually tell is just click on FPS controller and then open your transform, and you'll see this Y value just going nuts because gravity is affecting the FPS controller. Now if I put the controller back above the ground, the way you know it's above is the bottom of this green capsule shape here. That's what's called a collider. These are surfaces that interact with other surfaces, these green collision detection zones. You might have heard that before in maybe talking about video games. If you hit play now, you should be able to walk around and there should be some sound. And our terrain is just a blank canvas. It's just like a grid, and it's really shiny. And it doesn't look like terrain, so let's change that. So now I'm going to click on the terrain object again and press F, and you can see how small a human would be on this terrain. So that gives you some context as you start designing. I'm going to now click this paintbrush tool, paint terrain, and there's a drop down that pops up underneath that. And if you go to raise and lower terrain, there's a bunch of brushes that you can choose from. I'm going to choose this sort of second one here because I kind of like the look of that. I'm going to make the size of it quite large, but I'm going to make the opacity really low, like 1. So now when I click with it, what's happening is it's painting in hills. Okay. Now if I had the opacity cranked up to like 23 and I click it, it's going to create like really tall hills right away. So I'm going to undo that because I want to make like more subtle terrain that's not going to essentially fill my project with giant mountains, which you can do if you want to. So I'm going to go ahead and paint a few more pieces of terrain in here, just rolling hills really. So I have a mountain there. And what you're seeing here where it's kind of going from like dark gray to back to white is if you look down in the bottom right, it says baking, ETA, and it's timing. Well, Unity is real-time baking the lighting into the texture, and that's just like an efficiency thing. So it's like calculating how the lighting is affecting the surface and putting that into the way the surface looks. And that's just a choice Unity made in how they design their software to make that light baking happen all the time. If it gets annoying for you and maybe your computer's a little slower than mine is, and that's taking too long and all your terrain looks black or dark gray, you can turn that off by going to Window, Rendering, Lighting Settings, and then this box will come up here, and right here at the bottom, you don't have to scroll. It says auto generate lighting. You can actually just check that, turn that off, and then close the box, and then now it won't do that anymore, and it'll just kind of stay standard. So I've got some mountains here, and the problem with this is I'm not creating a snow area. I'm actually creating like a forest. So I need to actually texture this to look more like dirt. So click on my terrain object again, click on the paintbrush tool again, and then instead of raise and lower terrain with the drop down, we're going to choose paint texture, And when we brought the standard assets in, it came in with some textures that work for ground planes and terrain. So I'm going to hit add layer. No, not add layer, sorry. Create layer. So right next to it is edit terrain layers, create layer, and then you're going to get this picker that's going to let you choose a specific JPEG basically, or image file that's in your project. And a lot of these are coming from standard assets. That's kind of where all this stuff came from. And some people might be tempted to just pick something that looks like a tree or something like that. That's not going to look very good because it's tiling it flat on your terrain. So you actually want to pick something that's like a top-down image. And these are textures for tree, like stumps and branches and stuff. So that's not what we're looking for. So something like this grass hill albedo or grass rocky albedo, that's what we want. So this will make everything sort of muddy, rocky, and then we can worry about painting in grass later. So when I brought that in, it just automatically, since it's the first layer in my paint textures, it went ahead and mapped it to everything. And say, like, as I zoom out, the pattern's obviously repeated over and over and over again. So if I wanted to change that, I can double click on it, I think. Maybe I can hit edit terrain. Nope, I guess not. Maybe if I hit open right here, yeah, that's it. So you click open and you can actually change the tile size. So like this is set to 2 meters by 2 meter tiles. I'm going to set it to be even bigger. I'll say 3 meters by 3 meters. And you see how it changes the tiling. So now if you press play, you'll see that that's over the top of your terrain. Oops. For some reason I just fell through everything. It's probably because when I pushed up the landscape, when I pushed up the landscape, my FPS controller is now below the ground. So I'm going to just lift the FPS controller up above the ground. There we go. There, it's starting to look now more like I have a dirt terrain area. So now let's give it some variation in the coloration of the ground. So I'm going to click terrain again, paint tool, and let's add another layer here. So we're going to edit terrain layers, add layer. Oh, I keep hitting add layer. It's not. It's create layer. There we go. And then I'm going to choose grass hill albedo. And you know me, I think I'm going to click on that and I want to start painting with it, but I want my brush size to be a little bit bigger. Well, maybe not that big. Yeah, that's good. And then the opacity's fine. And I'm thinking that like with hills and mountains like this, that the water would run down the hill so that the grass would sort of form down in the valleys, but there'd be sunlight, I guess, on the tops. So maybe the grass is actually more like on the tops and sides here. So I'm going to just start clicking and dragging, and you can see you're sort of layering the coloration together. Okay, it's a little hill right here. Just do it like little sparse patches down here in the valley. Okay. And then let's yet again create another layer, and there should be another one in here somewhere. Yeah, this cliff albedo specular. I'm going to select that here. So you have to actually click it to use it. Make my brush size a little bit smaller. And some of these like real vertical sections, like right here, I'm going to paint that in. And that looks a little bit too tiled. So I'm going to go ahead and change it by clicking on it first and then hitting open, and then changing the tiling size to be, I'm going to go 5 and 5. There we go. That looks a little bit more blended in. So you see how this works. You're just sort of layering in assets. So I have to click back to terrain to get back to it. Actually, I don't want to create a new layer. I'm just going to keep painting with that one, but I'm going to apply it to these like vertical facing areas. Yeah, like that. And you can bring in your own JPEGs and then add them as terrain layer pictures that you can paint into the terrain itself. Now we're missing like things like trees and grass. So let's look into trees next. So what we do there is we actually click this button next to the paint button, and we can hit add tree or edit trees. add tree, and this little icon box comes up here for tree prefab. So prefabs, like I mentioned, I was going to talk about later. I'll just say real quick, prefabs are like pre-configured like objects. Like, so they'd be a game object that has all of the scripts and all of the arrangement needed from being you can see here this FPS controller is blue. That means it's a prefab. And it already came in with all the scripts configured and set up properly, and it has child game objects that are also all configured and set up properly. And someone made this for us at Unity, and then we're able to use it. It's all done for us. We don't have to spend the time to make it. That's what prefabs are. It's just sort of pre-configured game objects or groups of game objects. Anyway, these trees are the same way. So tree prefab, none right now. You can click these little circles. These mean browse in Unity if you see that little icon. And we're looking for like a tree that looks like this, like broadleaf desktop, broadleaf mobile, conifer desktop. We'll use the conifer one here. So I'm just going to double click that, and then it shows up there. I'll hit add, and then going back to the terrain object on the tree, you can see there's the conifer desktop, and then I can paint them in. Now if I click once, we're going to just have a ton of trees that are really tall. Okay, so we want to vary these trees because we're only that big right there. So if you go back to your tree over on the right, there's a bunch of settings for your brush size, tree density. Let's turn the tree density down. So now if I click, we only get a few trees. That's good. And I like this tree height, how it's randomized, but it's set a little bit too high. So I'm going to take it to the left, and you can actually control the left and right side. So this is going to be like a range of heights of trees, because not every tree is the same size, right? It's on tree farms maybe, but if that's not what you're making, like making a forest, it should be sort of varied quite a bit from smaller trees to bigger trees. So that's good. I'll click that. That makes it a little bit more realistic. And then as I click, they're just sort of filling in here. And then if you wanted to make this more realistic, you could vary the type of tree. So I'm going to add another tree just like we did before with the paint layer, and I'm going to choose broadleaf desktop. Add. Got some of those. Okay, there you go. Now we've got trees in our environment. The shadows are pretty harsh on the ground like that, but that's okay. We can bake the lighting easily. Remember, we turned it off, so you go to Window, General, Rendering, Lighting Settings. You can actually hit this auto lighting just for a moment, let it happen. In the background, you'll see it'll soften up those shadows and make it look kind of nice, and then turn it back off. I'm going to close that. Okay, so that looks a little bit better, and we need some grasses. We just have the texture of grasses on the ground, so let's add some grasses. So I'm going to go to this next button here that's Paint Details, and then you click New Brush. Actually, no, you don't click New Brush. What do you click? Oh, down below here you go to Details. No detail objects defined, so we're going to define one. Edit details, add a grass texture. Okay, another dialog box pops up, and detail texture, that's what we're looking for. Click browse, and for this specifically, anything that's a detail texture, it's just going to be like a PNG like texture or PSD file here, like this one here, this grass, or this one here. I think we only have two with standard assets, those two. So I'll click that, and then you can kind of vary the color of it. I'm going to leave the colors as they are and hit add. So there it shows up. And once again, if you click, it's just sort of too dense. That's just far too much grass. So if we hit play, we're just going to have just a massive amount of grass, and that just, it's not bad. If you want this effect, you can go with this. But oh yeah, by the way, if you need your cursor back, just hit escape on your keyboard and you'll get your cursor back to get back out of play mode when you're using the FPS controller. What I'm going to do is hit undo, and then edit. Oh, actually no, I'm going to change the brush size a little bit, and the opacity, instead of being 1, I'm going to set it to like 0.1 or so. Still a little bit too dense, so I'm going to turn it way down. And it's still a little bit too much, because I just want like little pockets of grass here and there. Yeah, like that. Like a real forest would be, because the sun doesn't shine in all of these spots all the time. Sort of spotted grass everywhere. Okay, now it's starting to look a little bit more usable. It's somewhat cartoonish still, but it's little bit more usable. We can, of course, add other grass textures, just as we just did. So I'll grab this other one, add, select it, add that. There we go. Now if I hit play, it looks pretty realistic. Or at least something that's usable. I shouldn't say realistic. Alright. So that's essentially the whole tutorial there. The point I'm trying to make here is that when you make virtual worlds, sometimes it's nice to have a starting point to map out a virtual world, and we just did one there in a little less than an hour. And as you look, I could go very large with this. I've seen Unity projects on SteamVR that all they do is take a 500 by 500 meter tile and they just build everything within it, like a city or a VR experience, and everything's just built on top of this, and that's the entire app. So you don't have to build large, expansive worlds that you've seen in maybe AAA title video games or large simulations and research. So this is just somewhat of an accessible point for people to get started in Unity building virtual worlds. So thanks. If you need any help, you can contact the AVL at vishelp@iu.edu.